When Clint Eastwood sat down for an interview on The Unfiltered Truth with Madison Steele, the audience expected yet another Hollywood guest, another round of debates. What they didn't anticipate, however, was that Madison, sharp, young, and infamous for dismantling conservative icons, was about to make the biggest misstep of her career. She thought she had him cornered, ready to serve up an easy viral moment. But what unfolded next would become legendary. In true Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't argue, didn't flinch. Instead, he transformed the entire interview into an unexpected lesson on faith, conviction, and why real strength never fades. That night, The Unfiltered Truth became something far more impactful than just another liberal talk show episode. The audience murmured with anticipation, their faces glowing under the studio lights, the cameras adjusted, capturing every angle of the sleek, polished set. The show had earned its reputation as one of the most watched liberal talk programs in the country, a space where conservative figures entered with confidence, only to leave with their reputations in tatters. But tonight, Madison Steele had secured her biggest guest yet. Madison, a young, blonde, razor-sharp journalist, had spent the past 5 years perfecting her aggressive gotcha style of questioning. She was ruthless, slicing through her guests with precision, her smirk as lethal as her well-rehearsed barbs. Some called her a rising star, others saw her as a smug opportunist, thriving off viral takedowns. Regardless, her audience adored her. She wasn't just interviewing Clint Eastwood, she was preparing to create a moment. A 94-year-old conservative legend sat before her, an icon of old-school masculinity who had openly discussed values Madison deemed outdated. She'd taken down senators, CEOs, and controversial figures before, but this was different. This was historic. As the show intro blared, the energy in the studio shifted. The crowd was ready, the social media team poised to upload the moment as soon as it hit. This wasn't just an interview, it was an event. Then Clint Eastwood entered. He moved slowly but with undeniable presence. No theatrics, no grand entrance, just the weight of his legacy doing all the talking. As he lowered into the chair across from Madison, something caught her eye. A small, silver cross, hanging just beneath the collar of his shirt. Her mind clicked into gear. This was going to be easier than she'd imagined. The cameras panned out, capturing the two figures across from each other. Madison Steele, flawless makeup and piercing blue eyes, leaning forward with the confidence that had made her famous. Clint Eastwood, relaxed, unreadable, his hands resting calmly in his lap, posture effortless yet commanding. The contrast was almost poetic. Madison, a young media powerhouse at the height of her influence, and Clint, a legend whose name carried weight far beyond the entertainment industry. For Madison, this was just another match to win. The audience was primed, waiting for her to start dismantling him, brick by brick. She had studied his every move, every word. Madison had watched past interviews, studied his old films, and knew exactly which buttons to push. The producers had prepared clips of controversial statements he'd made over the years, ready to play at the perfect moment. But before they even got to that, her eyes kept returning to the cross necklace, small, worn, and unassuming. Her lips twitched into a smirk. Oh, this was a gift. Religion wasn't something Hollywood liked to discuss anymore, especially the kind Clint represented. Traditional, conservative, a relic from a time the industry had long tried to leave behind. Madison saw it clearly now. The headline practically wrote itself. Clint Eastwood, out of touch with modern America. Hollywood legend. Clings to outdated beliefs and gets called out on live TV. She didn't even need to plan this angle. It was already in motion, but Clint gave nothing away. He sat there, the studio lights blazing down on him, yet unshaken, unbothered, as if he had already seen this play out 1,000 times. Because, of course he had. He'd stared down directors, studio execs, and entire generations of critics who thought they could write him off. He had outlasted them all, and now, at 94, he was about to face Madison Steele, not as an adversary but as an observer. Madison thought she was in control, leading the charge, but Clint knew something she didn't. He had already won. The air in the studio was thick with expectation. The audience had settled into that space between curiosity and entertainment, waiting for the moment Madison Steele would strike. They had seen it before. Her guest would relax, fall into the rhythm of conversation, and then, just when they least expected it, she'd land the first blow. And sure enough, on cue, Madison leaned in, her signature smirk pulling at the corners of her lips. She always knew when to push, when to act amused, when to feign concern. It was a formula she had perfected over the years. She casually gestured toward Clint's chest, where the small silver cross hung just below his collar. "Clint, I have to ask," she began, her voice dripping with a calculated lightness. "What's with the cross? Didn't peg you for the jewelry type." The audience chuckled, a ripple of scattered laughter filling the air. Some thought it was an innocent joke, just playful banter. Others, though, sensed the shift, the change in tone that signaled Madison wasn't just asking. She was probing, a test, a challenge. But Clint didn't react, not the way she expected. He didn't shift uncomfortably, furrow his brow, or flash a defensive grin. Instead, he sat there, completely at ease, letting the words float in the air, unclaimed, insignificant. Then he did something that threw her off just a little. He smiled, not a forced, media-trained smile, not a nervous or uncomfortable one. No, it was something else entirely. It was the kind of smile that made Madison pause, if only for a moment. The kind of smile a man gives when he's heard it all before. The audience wasn't sure what to make of it. The chuckles faded, a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They'd seen guests fumble on this show, but Clint Eastwood wasn't fumbling. He was just watching, observing. Madison caught the hesitation in the air, the energy that wasn't quite working in her favor. She needed to push further. So she did. Madison tilted her head, pretending to process his lack of reaction. "Come on, Clint," she said, her voice adopting that honeyed, condescending tone she reserved for guests she was about to tear down. "You've built an entire career playing the tough guy, the cowboy, the no-nonsense enforcer, the man who doesn't take orders from anyone." She let the words settle, painting him into a corner, and then, with perfect timing, she delivered the punchline. "And yet, here you are, wearing a cross like some choir boy." The laughter from the audience was louder this time. A few people clapped. That was the reaction she wanted, exactly what she had been hoping for. Her eyes caught the flicker of movement from the producers at the back of the studio, the signal that they'd clipped the soundbite, already prepping it for social media. A slow smirk spread across her lips as she pressed on. "Come on, Clint, isn't this a little outdated, a little, what's the word, out of touch?" More laughter filled the room. Madison could already see the headlines in her mind. Hollywood, legend caught in time warp. Clint Eastwood clings to old-school religion in a changing world. Her eyes gleamed as she studied his face, waiting for him to crack, waiting for him to fumble, for him to give her the reaction she so desperately wanted. But Clint Eastwood didn't fumble. He didn't even blink. He simply lifted his eyes slowly, deliberately. And in that moment, the air shifted. The laughter died down, but not because the joke was over. It was because everyone in the room suddenly realized that the joke had never been on him. It had been on her. The room fell silent. The energy that had been buzzing with laughter just moments ago now felt thick, unmoving, like the calm before a storm. Clint Eastwood sat there, quiet, unmoved, his expression unreadable. He didn't fidget, didn't glance toward the cameras, didn't react the way guests were supposed to on The Unfiltered Truth. He simply let the silence breathe. Then, in that unmistakable, gravelly voice, the one that carried decades of weight with just a few syllables, he spoke. "You think it's funny? You think—" His words weren't loud, they weren't sharp, but they cut through the room like a knife anyway. Madison Steele chuckled, but it was different now, forced, uncertain. The confidence in her posture faltered, just for a split second, barely noticeable. "Unless you were paying attention." Clint was paying attention. "No, well, it's a little surprising, that's all," she said, trying to regain control. Her tone was lighter now, backpedaling. "I mean, faith isn't exactly Hollywood's favorite subject these days." She smiled again, but this time it didn't land the way it usually did, because Clint Eastwood wasn't playing the game. His eyes locked onto hers, steady and unreadable. He wasn't on the defensive. He wasn't even bothered. Then finally, he gave her the answer she wasn't expecting. "That's why I don't care what Hollywood thinks." The words landed with a weight that took Madison completely off guard. It hit like a hammer. No explanation, no justification, just a simple fact. The audience shifted. Some of them had been waiting for him to stumble, to scramble for footing, but instead, he had planted himself like a stone wall. Madison opened her mouth. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say, because Clint Eastwood hadn't just answered her, he had ended the conversation. The studio was so quiet now that you could hear the faint hum of the cameras rolling. The shift had happened. The same shift that always occurred when Clint Eastwood decided to take control of the moment. Slowly, deliberately, Clint lifted the small silver cross necklace between his fingers, holding it just high enough for the camera to catch the way the light flickered against its surface. His thumb ran across the worn edges, a simple gesture, completely absent of theatrics, yet somehow making the moment feel even heavier. And then, without any build-up or grand reveal, he spoke. This was my father's. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. Clint didn't look at Madison as he spoke, didn't try to convince anyone in the room of anything. He wasn't concerned about how it came across. Not because I thought it looked good. Not because it's a trend. He paused, still turning the cross over in his fingers. But because it reminds me of who I am. There it was. The shift in the room. The shift in the energy. The shift in the entire conversation. The people who had laughed just minutes ago were now leaning forward, their amusement gone. Because what Clint had just said wasn't just about him. It was about them. Then came the final line, the one that cut through the air, through the show, through the entire point of this interview. "Some people wear jewelry to show off," he said, locking eyes with Madison for the first time. "Others wear it because it means something." Silence. Madison sat there staring, unsure of what to say next. The audience had already decided who had won this moment. Because once again, Clint Eastwood had spoken, and the world was listening. The laughter was gone. Not faded. Not quieted. Gone. In its place, a heavy, uncomfortable silence hung over the studio like a thick fog. The very audience that had been so eager to laugh along with Madison Steele just moments ago now shifted uneasily in their seats. Some exchanged glances. Others stared straight ahead, unsure whether they were supposed to still be entertained or if something real was actually happening. And at the center of it all, Clint Eastwood, calm, still, unshaken. Across from him, Madison Steele was trying not to squirm. She had been here before, interviews that got tense, moments where a guest pushed back. But this was different because Clint wasn't pushing back. He was just sitting there, letting the weight of his words settle like stones on the studio floor. She forced a laugh, a touch too bright, too rehearsed. The kind of laugh that said, "I still have control of this moment. I wasn't trying to." "Be disrespectful, Clint," she said, tilting her head slightly, the warmth in her tone now laced with something else, defensiveness. "I just think it's an interesting choice for someone like you," she said, gesturing vaguely at the cross, as if trying to steer the moment back to something light, something playful. But Clint wasn't playing. His reply came, without hesitation, steady and sure. "You wouldn't have mocked it if it was any other symbol." The audience murmured. Some nodded, others whispered because they knew he was right. And Madison knew it too, she just couldn't admit it. Madison Steele was good at what she did, one of the best. She had spent years refining her technique, knowing exactly how to navigate difficult moments, how to reframe a conversation when it wasn't going her way. And right now she needed to reframe this. She leaned back ever so slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture and softening her expression, trying to make it look like just a friendly conversation. "Look, I respect faith. I do," she said, her voice gentler now, almost diplomatic. "I just think we've moved past needing things like that." A small nod, a slight shrug, as if she was just offering a reasonable perspective. The audience watched. The crew waited. And Clint? He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't lean forward. He did nothing but hold his ground, like he had been doing for nearly a century. Then he spoke, slow, measured, certain. Moved past needing faith. He let the words linger, his gaze never leaving hers. And then came the question that hit, like a bullet. "Tell me something, sweetheart. What do you believe in?" The audience leaned in, and for the first time all night, Madison Steele stumbled. It was subtle, a flicker of hesitation, a fraction of a second where she didn't have the perfectly polished response ready to go. The cameras caught it. The audience felt it. And Clint Eastwood, he saw it. And then the knockout line. "Because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." The silence that followed was different. Not tense, not awkward, just final. The moment that had started as a joke was now etched into history, because Madison Steele had walked into this interview thinking she was the one setting the trap. But Clint Eastwood, he had just closed it. It happened fast, faster than anyone expected. Before the interview had even wrapped. Before Madison Steele had a chance to issue some well-crafted damage control statement. Before the network had even decided how to spin it, the internet had already spoken. The clip went viral. Not just trending, not just getting attention, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Within minutes, the soundbite of Clint's final words, "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything," was all anyone could talk about.